You are listening to the GrandCanyonTV audio tour for Grandview Point. Grandview Point is 8 miles or 13 kilometers east of the Visitors Center. There are no shuttle buses that take you there, so the ideal way to get to Grandview Point is in your own vehicle or on a tour. There is limited parking at the viewpoint. There are restrooms at the viewpoint, yet understand there is no piping headed to this part of the canyon. There is absolutely no filtered water, no running water at Grandview Point. You will need all of your water with you, especially note this if you are planning to hike on the Grandview Trail, because if you hike on the Grandview Trail and run out of water, even when you make it back up to the top, there will be no water there. So please do be prepared while you are driving to these further out viewpoints at the Grand Canyon. I recommend keeping water, snacks, blankets, hats, gloves, rain gear, a first aid kit, and toilet paper in your vehicle. Because throughout my time, I never even had phone signal at Grandview Point. And this is important in case you lock your keys in the car or you're just in a tough situation. It's one of the highest points on the South Rim, which means the pines are very tall. I once was leading a Jeep tour and we had stopped at Grandview Point and a big storm came in and the winds knocked down a pine tree, which fell across the one road leading you into and out of the viewpoint. Everybody had to wait for the National Park Service to come and chop up the tree before we could leave. Be prepared, and speaking of height, Grandview Point is at an elevation of 7,375 feet or 2,245 meters above sea level. They get a lot of snow, and this viewpoint can often close during the winter. Now, let's get into what Grandview Point is all about. As you park your vehicle, take a walk towards the main viewpoint to find the information kiosks. Some of these have photos, and I will read these information kiosks to you, so feel free to just take in the scenes of Grandview Point. The main kiosk reads, Grandview, 1898. Quote, "No language can fully describe, no artist paint the beauty, grandeur, immensity, and sublimity of this most wonderful production of nature's great architect. Grand Canyon must be appreciated." C.O. Hall, Grand Canyon Visitor, 1895. This is what people were saying. People were blown away, especially East Coast people showing up to Grand Canyon, just totally blown away by what they were seeing. And I still see this every day at the Grand Canyon. Reports like this from early tourists aroused curiosity and stimulated Grand Canyon tourism. The sign continues, the year is 1898. You have come to decide whether the lofty reports you've heard about Grand Canyon are true. Pete Barry, miner turned hotel manager, greets you here at his Grandview Hotel and escorts you to the canyon rim. Awestruck, you quickly forget your bone-jarring 12-hour stagecoach ride from Flagstaff. You begin to ponder tomorrow's mule ride into the canyon. Thus began Grand Canyon tourism. Mining proved only briefly profitable, so a few entrepreneurs like Pete Barry turned to tourists for profits. In 1893, Barry offered crude lodging in a cabin here at Grandview and began guiding eager mule-riding patrons into the canyon. In 1897, he built a 2-story log hotel and later added a large frame building. Until 1901, Grandview was Grand Canyon's most popular tourist destination. Grandview boasted the best hotel and some said the best trail. After 1901, when the Santa Fe Railroad reached Grand Canyon Village, 11 miles west of here, few tourists opted for the jolting stagecoach ride to Grandview. Today, little remains of Pete Berry's hotel on the rim. All right, so they're giving you a brief idea of what happened here. Now stay tuned because I'm going to get a little deeper into the history. This kiosk also has some black and white photographs on it. Number 1 is the Grandview Hotel in 1902. Photo number 2, the Grandview from a distance, perched on the canyon edge. So the Grandview Hotel no longer exists. It was torn down in the 1930s, and it didn't sit where the parking lot is today. It was actually a few miles to the east. It seemed Pete Berry must have ended his stagecoach rides from Flagstaff and built his cabin and hotel over there. However, there wasn't an ideal place to make a trail into the canyon because the cliffs were too steep. So Grandview Point became the place where he built a trail that would lead down to mines inside of the canyon. Photo number 3 on the sign is Martha and Pete Berry from 1905. Now, when I first trained as a Grand Canyon guide, everyone told me that Pete Berry married his brother's widow. People pointed to this photo and they said, that's Pete Berry and his brother's widow. And everybody told this story. However, I have worked hard to become a next level super Grand Canyon historian at this point, and I am telling you that is not true. Okay, so who is this Martha woman in the photo with Pete? Well, there were many visitors at Grandview in the summer of 1900, including a 38-year-old Illinois woman named Martha J. Thompson. She ended up heading to the Grand Canyon for a vacation in 1900. However, she ended up staying on at the old Grandview Hotel as the hotel housekeeper and became Pete's close companion. On August 26, 1903, Pete and Martha were married in Flagstaff. All right, so that photo, that Martha in that photo with Pete, that becomes his wife, but that is not his brother's widow. Photo number 4 here shows the interior of the Grandview Hotel from 1906. You can see it looks like a nice, cozy log cabin. It's got rocking chairs, there's no TVs, no Wi-Fi, no smartphones. Ah, that must have been relaxing. I mean, these people and the visitors must have truly felt they were on the edge of the world. And the night sky, just imagine the night sky they saw without any light pollution, any headlights, airplanes, or satellites. Man, something I can only dream of. Photo number 5 shows early visitors touring the canyon rim by stagecoach. Now, I'd suggest walking to the front of the main viewpoint. You'll notice the Grandview Trail to your right and the Colorado River way out there. I'll get to the other side of that kiosk, don't worry. Straight ahead off the main viewpoint, yet down in the canyon, is what we call the Horseshoe Mesa. Not to be confused with Horseshoe Bend. The Horseshoe Mesa is about 3 miles or 5K down the trail. It's going to take you hours to get there. It's in that beautiful red rock layer. It's got a bunch of juniper trees speckling it. This is where Pete was doing his copper mining at the Last Chance Mine. The kiosk at the front of the viewpoint reads, "If a horseshoe can bring luck, why not a horseshoe-shaped mesa?" Some 2,500 feet, 760 meters below you, sits Horseshoe Mesa. There, in 1890, Pete Berry and fellow miners discovered copper and began digging the Last Chance Mine. The ore was rich, 15 to 30% pure copper. But like all Grand Canyon mines, the amount of ore was small. Berry created other opportunities to make money. In 1897, he built the Grandview Hotel near here, and adventuresome tourists mingled with the miners on Horseshoe Mesa. But when the railroad came to Grand Canyon in 1901, its depot was 14 miles away from Barry's hotel. 1907, copper prices crashed. Luck had changed for Pete and his wife Martha, so in 1919, they left, moving to their son's ranch outside of the park. Remember, it didn't even become a national park until 1919. So that's when he leaves. But what happened? The kiosk does have some photos. The first one shows Barry and his crew had built a 3-mile, 5-kilometer long trail to the mine, which was one of the finest constructed trails in the Grand Canyon during the pioneer period. All right, so if you were to hike there and back, that is a 6-mile or 10K hike. And I'm telling you, that's going to take a minimum of 4 hours, probably more like 6-7 hours. On another photo, it shows the miners had a dining hall and bunkhouse on the mesa, so they didn't have to come back up every single day. They could stay down there. And a third photo shows mules and burros carried 200-pound, 90-kilogram loads of copper ore up the trail. From Grandview Point, the ore was placed on trains passing through Flagstaff and shipped to El Paso, Texas. I believe it went there to be refined. I want to explain the other side of the first kiosk, and then I'm going to give you even more detail of the history of this area because I got a whole lot more to offer you guys than these kiosks say. And truly, a lot of these stories are at risk of being lost to time. I've spent much of my time digging through microfilm and interviewing people, and I really do want to keep these stories alive. So the other side of that main kiosk reads, mining on Horseshoe Mesa. In 1890, prospector Pete Barry staked the Last Chance copper claim 3,000 feet below you on Horseshoe Mesa. The Last Chance mine began a 17-year flurry of activity here at Grandview Point. For a while, the Last Chance mine thrived. The ore was rich. It claimed a World's Fair prize in Chicago in 1893 for being over 70% pure copper. But the high cost of packing ore to the rim, then shipping it to be refined, doomed the operation. Barry and his partners sold the mine in 1901. The new owners continued mining, but ceased when copper prices plunged in 1907. Mining on Horseshoe Mesa, though short-lived, had a lasting impact. Grandview became Grand Canyon's most popular tourist area for about 10 years when Grand Canyon tourism was in its infancy. The Grandview Trail, built by Last Chance miners to reach their mines, now serves thousands of hikers each year. Remember, if you guys are thinking about hiking that trail, you can tell I'm really stressing this, but it's a dangerous trail. I do recommend using South Kaibab or Bright Angel Trail for your first Grand Canyon hike. Get a feel of how that is because Grandview is much more difficult than those. And to really give you a short history of the trails, Bright Angel Trail dates back thousands of years. It was probably made by the ancestral Puebloan people. Trails like the Hermit Trail, the South Kaibab Trail, and the Grandview Trail, these are modern trails which were made in the past 150 years. Grandview, however, from my research, is the first of the modern trails to be made. And for that reason, it is considered a historic trail. And that means they are only able to restore the trail using techniques from the 1800s, which leads to it being a much rougher and more technical trail than Bright Angel or South Kaibab. We get more photos on the last kiosk here. Photo 1 shows the Last Chance mine on Horseshoe Mesa in the 1890s. Mules and burros packed everything in and packed out tons of ore. Miners earned $4 a day plus meals. Photo 2, inspectors sample ore in 1907 for a company report. The results are good, but copper prices crashed that year, dooming the mine. Photo number 3, entrance to the new tunnel, 1906. The narrow gauge rails brought ore from the mine and carried waste rock to the dump. The large timbers were packed in from the rim. So guys, there's actually all kinds of metal equipment rusting away down there. Photo number 4, the Canyon Copper Company dining room in 1906. And photo 5, the crew poses for the company report. The crew averaged just 5 men between 1902 and 1907, but the camp could accommodate 25. All right, so they had a bunch of buildings down there. They had mining equipment. A lot of this stuff has been removed since it became a national park, but there are some things that are just so heavy, nobody's pulling it out of there. It's considered historic trash. You are not to remove it. So they had a small crew. Of course, when you're mining precious metals, you want as few people involved as possible because you can imagine, these gold mines and diamond mines and people are trying to stuff gold and diamonds in their socks or hide it under their tongue, right? So most of the time they had 5 or 6 people working down there. If you are thinking that you can just hike down the Grandview Trail today and walk into those mines and grab some copper, you're wrong. You can't take anything from the national park, even some of that metal trash, that's historic trash. You are not to remove it. So please help preserve this beautiful place. And honestly, if you went down there and even found the mines, you're going to find there are metal bars covering the entrances. There are critters that have moved into those entrances. We're talking bats and possibly bobcats, mountain lions. So those bars are on there for your safety. Also, in the World War II era, they started finding uranium in that same area and used those mines to pull out uranium. So down in some of those areas, you are going to see signs that say, caution, radioactive, keep out. And that is no joke. I seriously recommend avoiding the actual mines. Now, all of these signs and all this information is great. They give you a general idea of what happened in the past, yet you know me. I want to break this down year by year and give you a play-by-play of how this all happened. So, if you guys are ready, I'm going to give you my Grandview timeline. The major catalyst, this is going to blow your mind, the major catalyst that even led to the first hotel being built at the Grand Canyon, it was the murder, the wrongful murder of John Barry in 1887. I mentioned this in my 1848 to 1902 timeline episode, and they never even mention John Barry at this viewpoint. All right, so John Barry ran a saloon in Flagstaff called the San Juan Saloon. Last year, I was digging through the microfilm in the Flagstaff Public Library, and I came across this old newspaper article from 1887 talking about the murder of John Barry. Well, John Barry was Pete Barry's brother. John had the most successful saloon in Flagstaff because it was the first one people saw when they got off the train. The location of John Barry's saloon, this is modern-day Karma Sushi on Route 66. That's the same building where Clyde Tombaugh had dinner the day he discovered Pluto. So it's right next to Collins Pub, Karma Sushi. That's the area we're talking about in Flagstaff. One night, John Barry is hit by a stray bullet during a bar fight. He dies right there in the Karma Sushi. And last year I walked into Karma Sushi. I was asking questions about the San Juan Saloon, and this old timer at the bar slowly turns his head and says, "San Juan Saloon? I haven't heard that name in decades." Turns out this old timer was the owner of Karma Sushi. He buys me a beer. I sit down next to him, and we sit there talking about the history of the building. So I'm really bringing you guys a story that was almost lost to time. Today, Karma Sushi has 2 different entrances. There's the original Karma Sushi on the left, and then a newer expansion on the right. The owner said he bought both properties, but because it's a historic building, he can't so much as make a walkway between them. But the history here is as juicy as the palate-cleansing ginger they serve. So John Barry is killed in 1887. The man who killed him goes to the Flagstaff jail. They said the jail was so easy to break out of that back then they just had somebody stand guard all night. The citizens of Flagstaff, these bar patrons, they were so hurt that their favorite bartender was killed by some dude from California firing off a gun, that they stormed to the jail that night. And all the newspaper article had to say was that the next morning, they walked into the jail to find the killer was dead and a noose was laying next to him. So it looked like this mob had a whole other plan and they ended up just killing the dude. All of this is what prompted Pete Barry to move to Flagstaff to take over his brother's business. And first, you should know a bit about the family. Pete and John's father died in 1872. He left them 120 acres of land. Pete and John ended up quitting their Missouri farm life. They sold their land and first joined the Silver Rush in Gunnison County, Colorado. Also worth noting that their mother was named Catherine Wolfe, a descendant of General Wolfe, the hero in the Battle of Quebec. This was a Revolutionary War battle that took place around the St. Lawrence River at Quebec City. The brothers leave Missouri. They're mining in Colorado. Pete is working hard and supplementing his miner's pay with ranch work. He starts investing his earnings into the local town by purchasing some of the first recorded lots. This town was called Quartzville, later became Pitkin, Colorado, when the town was incorporated in 1879. He worked on the Eagle Lodge north of town in the summer of 1881 and became part owner of the Carthage Lodge in 1882. Perhaps predicting his future in Arizona, mines at the Quartz Creek Mining District, they had names for their mines like Flagstaff, Horseshoe, and Last Chance. Remember that the train tracks first reached Flagstaff in 1882. Flagstaff wasn't even a town when Pete Barry and John Barry were working in Colorado. But then the train arrives and Flagstaff starts to grow. John Barry, tired of the rock-hard labor in the mines, left Pitkin, Colorado in 1883. He moved to Flagstaff, Arizona, where he opened the San Juan Saloon and Club. The saloon became the gathering place for travelers and townspeople. John began investing in brokerage and banking enterprises. Pete visited him in mid-February of 1884. This is about 3 years before John is going to get wrongfully murdered. Well, when Pete came to visit 3 years before he's murdered, he was blown away by his brother's success. In August of that same year, John Barry married Mary Parker in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Mary was already divorced with a son named Sam Parker. She shortened her name to May, and in 1885, the couple had a son together and named him Newton. I wonder if he's named after Isaac Newton. Everything was going really well for John Barry. And then at the age of 33, yes, that sacred 33, at the age of 33, he's killed. His son wasn't even 2 years old. So now you can see why the whole town of Flagstaff was so upset about a tourist from California killing their favorite businessman, that they went and murdered the killer. So Pete arrives from Colorado within weeks, and immediately he begins tending to the needs of his brother's business and his brother's widow. So that's where the tour guide story gets all twisted. That photograph at Grandview Point, that is not the brother's widow. There's more to this. Pete ends up marrying his brother's widow, May, on September 30th of 1888. 1888, remember that's when PAL creates the National Geographic Society. So in the photograph at Grandview Point, it is Martha, not May. What happens here? Pete built a new house for his ready-made family, and on May 15, 1889, a son was born. Pete named his son Ralph J. Barry after Ralph Cameron, his longtime friend. And I got to dig into this, but it's possible that Pete is the one who brought Ralph Cameron to the Grand Canyon. I'll have to ask about that and talk about that in a future episode. Now, remember, it's 1889. Pete begins making prospecting trips to the Grand Canyon. Also note that Karma Sushi and Collins Pub, those are right around the corner from the Bank Hotel in Flagstaff, the McMillan Building. So back then in the 1890s, that intersection in Flagstaff, LaRose Street, that was where stagecoaches would leave heading for the Grand Canyon. Because in the 1890s, there was no highway. There was no train to take you to the Grand Canyon. All of these Grand Canyon stagecoaches would leave from LaRose Street, and it would take at least 12 hours to reach the canyon from Flagstaff. Today, that takes about an hour and a half. In 1890, Thomas F. McMillan, Pete Berry, Ralph and Niles Cameron, Edwin Gale, and Robert Ferguson began searching the Grand Canyon for minerals worth mining. This is what Pete was good at. Remember, he had done this in Colorado, but he got sidetracked for a few years because of his brother's wrongful death. On a day in April of 1890, the group located a rich vein of copper on Horseshoe Mesa. Under the name The Last Chance Mining Company, the partners developed their claim. To facilitate canyon access and ore removal, Pete helped engineer the Bright Angel and Grandview trails. That's also something I want to research more. I know the Bright Angel Trail goes back to the ancestral Puebloan people because it's one of the only trails that has pictographs on the trail. However, there are a couple tunnels on Bright Angel that were blasted with dynamite. My question is, who blasted those tunnels? Was it Pete Berry in the 1890s who blasted those tunnels? I don't know. I got to look into that. By 1891, prospecting partners Pete Berry and Niles and Ralph Cameron had improved the Bright Angel Trail to better reach mining sites within the canyon. In February of 1891, Berry registered the trail as the Bright Angel Toll Road. Later, Pete Berry transferred control of the Bright Angel Trail to Ralph Cameron in exchange for ownership of the Grandview Toll Road. Now, this is not the best of news for the Havasupai tribal members who are still living along the Bright Angel Trail at Havasu Gardens and the area that will become known as Phantom Ranch. Right? These guys are trying to find minerals and they're trying to develop the trail. So that's actually going to create some tension. It's not going to be great for the Havasupai people. In my research, this all roots back to John Berry being killed. And sure, some other prospectors probably would have moved into Grand Canyon and started creating tension with the native people. But when you think about it, all rooting back to John Berry getting wrongfully killed by some Californian while he was working at the San Juan Saloon, it's crazy. That leads his brother Pete to move to Flagstaff. And then Pete starts looking at the Grand Canyon and thinking, I can make a lot of money by going down there and finding precious metals. So this is also the reason for the trails in the mines of the 1890s. I mean, that one little catalyst leads to Bright Angel Trail being developed, the Grandview Trail being developed. Pete will make national, if not worldwide news in 1893 when he brings a 600-pound solid piece of 70% pure copper to the Chicago World's Fair. This was brought all the way up from the Horseshoe Mesa. They said on February 22nd of 1893, Pete Berry departed Flagstaff to watch over the giant boulder of copper as it made its way to Chicago. The Field Museum in Chicago bought the 600-pound piece of copper for $1 a pound. That's insane. 6 men, along with the help of their burros, dragged the 600-pound piece of copper up the Grandview Trail. It took them 6 days. And I'm really curious what the Chicago Field Museum did with it. Do they still have it in their archives? Somebody please tell me that they still do. Now, while Pete is having all this fun and finding copper and going to the Chicago World's Fair, he has hired employees to run the San Juan Saloon. And his new wife, May, his brother's widow, she's left home alone with the kids in Flagstaff. May finds another saloon man, A.E. Frankfurter. himself at one time employed by Pete in the mines. In October of 1893, Pete suspects May of infidelity and mistreatment of their 4-year-old son, and Pete Barry gets arrested for shooting Frankfurter in the legs. He claimed it was an accident, and the matter was dismissed. Pete took his son Ralph and boarded the eastbound Overland Express for San Miguel, New Mexico, where he secretly placed Ralph in the care of the Sisters of Charity. May promptly filed for divorce and demanded custody of their son on the grounds that her husband had failed to provide the necessities and comforts of life. When their divorce was granted on March 19 of 1894, May married Frankfurter. All right, so after that whole Chicago World's Fair is over, the next year, 1894, they're divorced. Pete moves from Flagstaff to his Grandview cabin, which served as his permanent residence and a mining base camp. What began as a log house near Grandview Point slowly became the famous Grandview Hotel. It officially opened for business in June of 1897 and became the new terminus for the Grand Canyon stage line. All right, so they would leave from the San Juan Saloon area, headed up LaRoe Street, travel for 12 hours, and then people would arrive at the Grandview Hotel. First ever hotel at the Grand Canyon, all because of the events of two wild and crazy brothers. Now, Grandview Hotel was possibly the first lodging to call itself a hotel at the Grand Canyon. However, I should give credit to John Hance. John Hance, and I'll make a whole audio tour about him, but John Hance had moved up to the South Rim near Grandview Point, wherever the stagecoach line was coming from Flagstaff and ending up there. John Hance had moved and built a cabin in 1881, and he did start renting rooms in 1883. So if I'm going to be super technical, Grandview wasn't the first lodging, but it was the first hotel. The 12th U.S. Census at Grand Canyon Forest Reserve showed Pete Barry, divorced head of family, age 42, owning his own home and working as a hotel proprietor. At Grandview, he also outfitted tourists with trail guides, pack animals, and camping provisions for below-rim excursions. His enterprise also offered carriage rides along the rim. In 1900, Martha J. Thompson arrives to Grandview. Okay, that's the woman in the photo. So this tourist comes to visit, stays at the Grandview Hotel, and ends up, falling in love with Pete Barry. And Pete Barry, hey, he had been through all kinds of stuff. He lost his wife. They divorced, but now he found love once again. Well, while Pete is distracted with his new hot woman, the railroad is built, connecting Flagstaff and Williams, Arizona to the South Rim. However, this railroad does not follow the stagecoach line from Flagstaff to Grandview. Nope. It ended up about 14 miles west, where the Grand Canyon Village sprung up and sits today. That was not good for Pete Barry's business. When early Grand Canyon visitors got off the train in Flagstaff and booked a stagecoach ride to the South Rim, it would take 12 hours to reach the Grandview Hotel. The train connection at Williams, this was much faster, so people could ride the train to Williams, get off there, switch trains, and because that train could carry more people, they could charge a whole lot less per seat. So business at Grandview Hotel starts dying off in 1901. Pete even tried offering free carriage rides from the South Rim train depot to the Grandview Hotel. In 1903, Pete and Martha get married in Flagstaff. The El Tovar Hotel is now under construction. And by 1905, El Tovar is open and taking pretty much all of the business away from Pete Barry. But he's still hanging in there. Copper prices crash in 1907. Remember, Pete, a little before that, had sold off his mines. He is starting to sell off the hotel in 1907 to the Canyon Copper Company, yet he continued to work at the hotel as the manager. So he essentially was bought out. At the same time, Pete Berry homesteaded 160 acres directly south of Grandview Point, where, under permit from the Secretary of Agriculture, he established a roadhouse, general store, and livery stables that he called the Summit Hotel, as it was located at the highest point on the South Rim. All right, so we're not talking the actual edge of the South Rim, but if you go in south of the South Rim, you get the highest point back there. That's pretty much where the Grandview Firewatch Tower is today. Pete Berry and John Hance were the only people to file a homestead entry on the South Rim. Pete's certificate, Homestead Entry 167, was signed by President Teddy Roosevelt on April 1st, 1907. About this time, Ralph Berry, his son, also filed for a homestead claiming 135 acres in the Coconino Basin. With year-round quarters on the South Rim, Pete served as unofficial guardian of the eastern end of the canyon. Remember, there's no desert view yet. So he served as his guardian for the Forest Service. He served as a guardian for the Park Service. He opposed the notion that the Santa Fe Railway and the Fred Harvey Company be given total control of the canyon country. And he had mixed feelings about the Grand Canyon becoming a national park. On October 1911, Pete gave publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst the option on his homestead, including the Canyon Copper Company properties. Pete closed his deal in October of 1913, selling his homestead for $35,000 to William Randolph Hearst. But he was still employed as sales agent for the Copper Company. This allowed Pete to clear his debts, including an old mortgage with Dave Babbitt. He bought a Hudson touring car. He bought an automobile, and he tried to interest some businessmen in establishing an automobile line to replace the old stage line from Flagstaff. He's basically trying to create a shuttle company to the Grand Canyon. By 1914, Pete was still managing the Grandview and Summit hotels and offering auto or stage pickup at the Canyon Train Depot. So he would drive people essentially from El Tovar area all the way out to Grandview to try to keep that place afloat, even though he doesn't really own it anymore. Now, at this point, this is 1914. Cars are around. The world is different. Airplanes exist. 1914 was the first appearance of Charlie Chaplin. Movies exist. Record players are common. And 1914, that's when the National Geographic magazine publishes the Cole brothers' massive article with photographs of the Grand Canyon. So remember, John Wesley Powell is the reason for National Geographic magazine. And now the whole world is starting to find out about Grand Canyon. Pete Berry had the first hotel, and it's falling apart at the moment people are finding out about it. El Tovar Hotel and Fred Harvey, they're going to make all the money. In October of 1916, the Grandview Hotel closed its doors for the last time. October 1916. This is also when World War I is taking place. Grandview closes. El Tovar is just too powerful. Pete and Martha, they moved to Ralph's Coconino Basin Ranch the following year. All right, they moved to their son's property. March 5th of 1919, it is now the Grand Canyon National Park. Pete and Martha's son, Ralph, dies of the Spanish influenza epidemic. He loses his son. He already lost his brother, lost his business. Oh man, what a fall from all the fame and fortune he had in 1893. So 1919, they lose their son, Ralph. This also claimed the life of John Hance. that Spanish flu. You probably heard about the Spanish flu during the COVID-19 crisis. People referenced that this flu that had taken place about 100 years earlier. The Spanish flu killed a lot of people in northern Arizona, especially Native Americans. I think I've heard numbers like half of the Hopi people died during the Spanish flu. I got to check that. I got to fact check that, but it was a lot of Native Americans died during that Spanish flu. This is something I've come to notice as well as a seasonal worker. All winter I might be good and healthy, and then spring break, the tourists come in and I am getting all kinds of sickness. Pete and Martha lived their remaining years at the ranch a few miles from Desert View. Throughout the 1920s, Pete and Martha remained aloof. All right, they're getting older. They're just kind of keeping to themselves. It's said that Pete Berry rarely drove to the Grand Canyon Village. He spent his time hunting wolves, trapping fox, and selling the furs. He operated a small trading post on the ranch, which happened to straddle the Gray Mountain Road used by Fred Harvey's excursions to Native American reservations. He traded with the Dene and often journeyed to Los Angeles to sell Dene blankets and return with merchandise to trade to the Dene. On occasion, a few relatives visited, who they called Uncle Pete, and National Park Service patrols occasionally stopped at the Berry Ranch for lunch or information. Eventually, a telephone line connected the El Tovar Hotel with fire patrols at Hull Tank. Pete had a key to the box for emergency fire use, but the new device became a major aggravation for him, as he could rarely make it work. Pete was partially crippled from a fall while working on the phone line in December of 1925. And in 1930, when both Pete and Martha were in poor health, Park Service provided a phone tap to his ranch from its Desert View line. Each morning, Pete was to report in. If there was no call, the park rangers would come to investigate. Historians tell me that Pete was terrified of using the phone. He hated phones. He said, "Damn these phones." On January 21st, 1931, Martha became desperately ill, and Pete, after much hesitation, determined that he just had to use the phone. Pete cranked and cranked, but neglected to flip the switch, and so failed to make a connection. And the tragedy of it all, Martha died of blood poisoning. Remembered as one of the best-loved Canyon citizens, she is buried in the Pioneer Cemetery in Grand Canyon Village. A year later, Pete was snowed in at his ranch, but friends kept in touch with him by telephone. In the summer of 1932, he suffered with stomach cancer, and he spent many weeks in Flagstaff's Mercy Hospital. Pete Berry grew homesick and was able to return to his ranch in August of 1932, where a visiting nephew cared for the 74-year-old Canyon pioneer. At this time, too, you can imagine Desert View watchtowers being built. At 10:15 p.m. on September 29th of 1932, Pete died. Funeral services were held at the community building, and graveside services were conducted by the Knights of Pythias at the Pioneer Cemetery. Knights of Pythias, that must have been a club Pete Berry was part of. That's one of these like secret societies that anybody can join. This one was created in Washington, D.C., the Knights of Pythias. Pete was laid to rest beside Martha and Ralph in the family plot. The following year, the Desert View Watchtower was opened and dedicated to the public, 1933. Its kiva logs had been cut by Pete and his partners for the Grandview Hotel. Wait, what? It was through the generosity of William Randolph Hearst that the kiva was able to preserve these historic logs. Okay, so when you walk into the Desert View Watchtower and you're on that ground level floor and you look up to the ceiling, it's made out of all those wood logs. Those are the logs Pete Barry cut himself at Grandview Point to create the Grandview Hotel. And William Randolph Hearst donated that to preserve that piece of history. That's a great little Easter egg, a secret inside of that watchtower. Inset stones and snubbed timbers still remain on the Grandview Trail from the work of Pete Barry. I have mixed feelings about this story. It seems Pete Barry didn't exactly have the greatest impact on the Grand Canyon in that he cut open mines and pulled precious metals from the canyon, and he helped develop trails that would lead to the Havasupai people being forcibly removed from the places they called home for thousands of years. Yet, the story is still quite fascinating. Pete Barry seems like the kind of person Martin Scorsese would make a film about. You know, this whole character rising from a farm in Missouri to riches and fame and appearing at the Chicago World's Fair and then watching it all crumble away from him in his final years as he's terrified of telephones. Pete Barry is also a classic example of an independent person having their own small business wiped out by a big corporation. Now, I breezed over the fact that William Randolph Hearst purchased the land and hotel from Pete Barry. And yes, the Hearst family, I mean, we're talking about William Randolph Hearst of the Hearst Castle in California, one of the wealthiest people in the world about 100 years ago. Well, the Hearst family is one of the only private owners of land at the Grand Canyon today. Hearst is famous for running newspapers, and the modern-day Hearst Communications Company, along with the Walt Disney Company, well, these two companies are the co-owners of the History Channel. Years ago, I was the Grand Canyon expert for the Walt Disney Company, working with their Adventures by Disney division. And I never made the connection to their media department, but if you've got connections and you want to put me in touch with History Channel or Disney Plus, I'd love to pitch a series of documentaries based on this Grand Canyon history. Special thanks to Karma Sushi in Flagstaff and Dick Brown for helping me find the missing pieces in the Grandview story. As always, I'm your host, Crocky Meshkin, and if you guys want to support me, I'm doing all this research, all these podcasts for free at this point. But if you guys want to support me, you can donate through Venmo at GrandCanyonTV. Venmo at GrandCanyonTV. Also, if you have a Flagstaff or Grand Canyon business and you would like to sponsor an episode for $500, I will shout out your business in the beginning and the end of one of these episodes.